jump right into it. Father God, we thank you so much for this day, Lord, and the changing of the seasons and the beauty of nature and all those things that show your power and awesomeness. Lord, we thank you for being our God, for loving us so much, that you gave us your word, that we can come together as brothers and sisters, that we can open your word, we can learn from it. And Lord, I pray that you be with us as we go through this time together, that you open our hearts and minds, help us to learn something from your word, something that will bring us closer to you, and will also help us to go out and bring others to you also. Lord, I pray that you bless us all. And thank you for all that you do for us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I like this teaching rotation we have. It's kind of different than what I'm used to. I'm used to class to class to class to class, but we have this I guess it's 5 people now, interval, so it's been like 5 weeks since I was not with you, but able to teach with you. And that's good in some ways. I like to hear other people's perspectives, of course, and to learn from other people, but also gets me out of my rhythm, so you'll have to bear with me as we dive back into it. We're still talking about the portrait of God, that 30,000 feet of how we look at the Bible and how everything in the Bible leads us back to that redemption, how everything in the Word leads us to Jesus or points to Jesus. And we're on the second part of a chapter that is called the United Kingdom. Trey divided this up into 3 parts, wisely so, because there's a lot in here. And I have to keep reminding myself that even though I love this story, I love the story of Saul and the transition to David and the exploits of David and all that he goes through, and I enjoy studying it, but we can't touch on everything. We can't go over every word, even though we would love to. We're still trying to figure out how this is at 30,000 feet. And so this evening we're going to talk about Saul, and then a little bit later we're going to talk about David and try to make those applications. But as I was reading about Saul and I was thinking about Saul, I was trying to figure out, why? Why does God choose Saul to be the first king of Israel? What is it about him that God finds appropriate or applicable to what a king should be? And we know that God, when Samuel went to God and said that the people of Israel wanted a king, they wanted to be just like all the other areas around them. They wanted their king to go out and help them win battles and all that good stuff. But God told them, I'm your king. You can't get any better than that. He said, you're my children. I'm your king. I'm going to take care of you. But they wanted an earthly king. They wanted to be like the other tribes, other areas. And so God said, okay, you get what you asked for. And you got a king. And I got to thinking about it even more. What are we to learn from Saul and the differences between Saul and the king that God wanted himself? I watch a lot of, I wouldn't say game shows, but you could call them game shows, I guess. I like watching these shows where artists come together and they have these competitions to see who puts out better art. And so I'll watch, it drives my wife crazy, I watched one that was all about making pottery in Great Britain. It was the Great Pottery Throwdown. And so there, if you didn't know, there's like 3 or 4 seasons. And all these potters come and they try to outdo each other by making the best pottery. And it's interesting. You have pottery experts in there, and they get passionate about their pottery and what makes good pottery. And then I watched one that was about glass blowing. And it was a competition to see who could make the best everything from figurines to pictures to glasses out of blowing glass. And that was really interesting. I forgot what it was called. The hot spot or something like that. Blown Away. There you go. I'm not the only one that watches these things. I even watch the fashion ones where they make the outfits and all that, and Project Runway and all that. And I love Tim Gunn. He's a cool dude. But I also watch Ink Masters. You know about Ink Masters? Ink Masters is where these tattoo artists, and they get people, and they call them the human canvases, which is crazy unto itself. These people go in there and they sit down and they let these people put tattoos on them that are permanent unless you go through a much more painful procedure. But they'll sit there and let them put anything they want on them. And they come up with some pretty incredible art. But what I really like is at the beginning of the show they have a flash challenge. And they'll take other mediums that they have and create art with it to show that these tattoo artists are really good artists, regardless of the medium that they have. And so I was watching it today, and that's what made me think of all this, because I was going back and forth between, I would watch television, and I'd come back and work on the lesson. But today the flash challenge was they've got these blank canvases, and with gunpowder and sand, they made these beautiful pictures. And then they lit the gunpowder, and it sparked up, blew up, and all that stuff. And shook all the sand off of it and everything. And where the burn marks were, and all was black, and different gradations of black. And then where the sand was, it remained white. It protected the white from the darkness or the black. And the whole point of the exercise was to show contrast. And I got to think about that. Contrast. And they talked about how the contrast is not only between light and dark, but it's between white and black. But it could also be different textures. But the main thing is to show that opposition. Two things together, but totally different. And so I kind of thought about, that may be why God chose Saul. Because this is the king they wanted. This, to all the other areas of around them, Saul was what a king was supposed to be. To the world. To their area. He was it. He was good looking, he was tall, he was strong, had a military mind, all these things. But he was the direct opposite, in contrast from God. And I think that's what he's doing here, is showing us how awesome God is and how God has this plan, but also he's wanting them to see how big of a mistake they make. And how by them choosing an earthly person to lead them or to be their king, they really missed out on what they could have had by having the King of Kings. And so I kind of thought about that as I came up with this and read over the book and everything as we're going through it. And even, at the very beginning, Saul was anointed, before he was anointed as king, he really had no relationship with God, hardly at all. There was definite signs of trouble ahead. Remember, he was completely unaware of who Samuel was. Samuel, the major prophet of God, the priest who was in charge of the tabernacle and all that good stuff. And Saul didn't know him. And even the fact that Samuel was the prophet of God, he didn't know. And so this idea of him being an enlightened servant of God, that just wasn't Saul. He really didn't have a relationship with God. And so at the very beginning, and this, we're going to kind of float all around, but we're kind of beginning in chapter 10 of 1 Samuel, if you want to go there. Samuel still is that go-between. He is the prophet of God, and God speaks through Samuel. And at the very beginning of Saul's reign, he tells Saul, he says, go down to Gilgal ahead of me. I will join you there to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. You must wait for 7 days until I arrive and give you further instructions. Now, I'm not an expert, but it's pretty cut and dry, right? There's not a lot of mystery in that command. There's not a lot of ambiguity. It's not really something you can say, now, did he mean 7 whole days? Or maybe he meant 7 times of daylight? Or maybe 7 midnights or something? Pretty clear cut what he meant, 7 days. And yet, Saul, he has trouble with that. Verse 8 of chapter 13 says, Saul waited there 7 days for Samuel, as Samuel had instructed him earlier. But Samuel still didn't come. Saul realized that his troops were rapidly slipping away. So he demanded, bring me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Saul sacrificed the burnt offering himself. Now, of course, it says here that he was afraid of losing his troops. That they were expecting a sacrifice, a celebration, a thankfulness to God for giving them a victory, so he didn't want to disappoint his people. But it also shows an impatience. Saul was not trained as a priest. He was not trained in how to do the sacrificing or to how to give a burnt offering. That just wasn't his wheelhouse. And so we see at the very beginning to where Saul is wanting to do things his own way. Samuel, when he sees that Saul is disobedient here, he says, how foolish. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. That would have been the reward. All you got to do is keep my commandments. If you do that, you would have been king, and your ancestors and everybody after you forever. But now your kingdom must end. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. So clearly, because of this, God is saying through Samuel, Saul's not it. He is not a man after God's own heart. We'll reserve that for David. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Can you imagine how old Saul felt? Here he is. He didn't want to be king in the first place. He didn't know anything about being a king. He was a donkey wrangler. And all of a sudden he gets to be king and gets to have a little bit of power, gets to do those things the king gets to do, has the victory given unto him, spreading the kingdom, but he didn't follow God's command. And so at the very beginning, even at the beginning, he's already told about his end. By this one act of disobedience, Saul had demonstrated his willingness to displace God's will with his own. How often do we do that? I feel like oftentimes I myself, I'm not a patient person at all. And coupled with that, I'm a control freak. I like to be in control. I like to have things planned out. I like things to go my way. And most of the time, that's just a fool's errand. You just can't do it. God's commandment to wait 7 days was a test for Saul. It was a test to see if Saul was going to be faithful. If Saul, how much love Saul had for God, and his commitment to God. And we'll see throughout Saul's reign, if you read more about Saul, often the trouble that he gets into and what happens with Saul is because he's not focusing, or he's not giving himself over to God. He's not allowing God to be in control. And he pays for it. See, Saul had a heart problem. And unlike David's, his heart was not in kinship with the heart of God. And so when Samuel confronted Saul for his failure to utterly destroy the Amalekites, as God had decreed, Saul blamed people, and he boasted that he had performed God's commandment. So even when he's given additional commands, he doesn't do what he's told, but he's got an excuse. He's always got a good excuse. Saul admitted to Samuel, "Yes, I have sinned. I have disobeyed your instructions," talking about Samuel, "and the Lord's command, for I was afraid of the people and did what they demanded." So for Saul, it was more important for him to do what the people wanted him to do, bring back the spoils of the Amalekites, instead of honoring God's command, instead of doing what God commanded. "But now, please forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." So here again, he's asking for forgiveness for something that he very well knew that he wasn't supposed to do. Samuel's got a pretty good reply for him. But Samuel replied, "I will not go back with you. Since you have rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king of Israel." He goes on. As Samuel turned to go, bless his heart, Saul tried to hold him back and tore the hem of Samuel's robe. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to someone else." It's not is going to give it to someone else, or in the future, or down the road, or after you die is going to give it to someone else. It's happened. So there's nothing you can do about it. You've made your bed, as it were. One who is better than you, and he who is the glory of Israel, will not lie, nor will he change his mind. For he is not human that he should change his mind. There is a definite contrast. That's the verse that speaks to that contrast. Saul, you flow like a wind. You kind of say, okay, everybody will like me more. I'll be more popular. I'll do what the people want if I do this. So I'm not going to do what God told me to. I'm not going to do what I initially planned. I'm going to do it my way. Versus, God's not human. He doesn't change His mind. He does what He says He is going to do. And so, poor old Saul, he doesn't like that answer. Saul pleaded again, I know I've sinned, but please at least honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel by coming back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. What's the problem with that statement? Yeah, he says you're God. He's not even talking about God as being his God. He's completely cut God out. Turned his back on him, as it were. And because of this, and of course, the good parts, David comes into the scene here and kind of makes his introduction and is anointed and kills Goliath, and Saul kind of gets the point, that David is the one that Samuel's talking about. And there's back and forth, and Saul knows that David's going to be the one who takes over the throne. And he does everything in his power to try to kill David. His heart is just filled with envy and hatred for David, and he attempts to kill him on numerous occasions. Those ideas of pinning him to the wall with his spear. And then he goes even further. And Saul scorned and even endeavored to kill Jonathan, his own son, because Jonathan was friends with David and took up for David. Kill his own son because he was going to take away what he thought should have been his. Even worse, slaughtered 85 priests of God and their families that had helped David. It's just that when he goes down big time. And even so, he spent his 40-year reign with a spirit of indifference toward the Ark of the Covenant. He barely mentions the Ark. He doesn't care to go get the Ark. He doesn't care about having the Ark with him. And we know that the Ark symbolizes God's presence. Yeah. It symbolizes God being with them. But Saul didn't care. Mine does that all the time too. You're good. It's a sad thing. But again, I think it highlights that contrast between an earthly king versus our Heavenly Father. So Saul was a man who was never seriously pondered the nature of God. He never talks about the nature of sin. He only admits to sin when it's pointed out, hey, Saul, you sinned. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. And he never thinks about the life-changing principles of redemption. Even when he he never really sincerely asked for forgiveness. He really just kind of loses that whole idea of being a man of God. He's extremely surface-oriented, shallow. And again, in terms of earthly kingdom, Saul's pretty good. For the most part, he did pretty well. But that's not what God wanted. And that's definitely not what God wanted for his people. And it's not what God would want for us. In the early part of David's reign, he learned a lesson on two separate, I think that was out of sequence. What do you have when that happens? Time out. This is one of those times when you're like, I wish I hadn't messed that up. Let's see. And I want to take this opportunity. This is Kathy's fault. Because she didn't, most of the time, she is supposed to proofread. No, that's where I was going. Okay. She is supposed to proofread. She didn't proofread for me today. I was just messing with her. Okay. So now we have a transition. And that transition is going into 2 Samuel. And that transition is to the differences between Saul and David. Saul, again, by his disobedience, demonstrated his willingness to just place God's will with his own. Again, it's the Frank Sinatra song. He wanted to do it his way. He didn't want to do it God's way. I thought about playing that song, and I didn't. I got you. So in contrast, David, he sins. But he immersed his sin in deep penitence and contriteness of heart. He throws himself on the mercy of God. Saul never dealt with his own sin in this manner. Saul had a heart problem. And he refused to admit his errors. So 2 Samuel covers 40 years' reign of David. His reign included beginning only with Judah. And after 7 years of civil war, fighting with the sons of Saul, David was anointed king over all of Israel. But in the early days of his reign, David learned a lesson on 2 separate occasions about the nature of God with regard to God's sovereignty, His ruling, and the principle of absolute authority. It's foundational to man's relationship with God. And again, I think that's where I slip up, is not remembering and keeping it always in my mind that God is God. God is the great I am. God is the absolute authority over everything. The first lesson arose from the death of Uzzah. We all remember this. God's law mandated, this is back in Numbers, that the ark be carried with staves on the shoulders of the Kohathites, descendants of Levi. And remember, back through Numbers, and if you just want some good reading, remember, read all those laws. It's so hard to read. But in all those laws and all those instructions, all good things come from God. He was very, 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 very specific and exactly how everything, all forms of worship, including how to carry the ark, be carried out and how it was to be done. And to us, it's like, what's the big deal? Why would that be such an important thing? And so the Kohathites performed their sacred duties under the sentence of death should a hand be placed upon the ark. So, you have the whole thing. I know this is the only point of reference that I have is Raiders of the Lost Ark. You have the poles that go through, and they were a specific length, and they were a specific type of wood, and they went through a specific holders on the ark, a specific number of men that were to carry the ark. And so they were to slide the poles through without touching the ark at all, lift it up on their shoulders, and carry the ark that way. Remember, it was to precede the tabernacle and everything else. And different people had the job of packing up the tabernacle and moving it and everything too. And it was in Numbers, it states that if you touched the ark, placed a hand on it, that didn't make a sound. You would be killed right then. So, David wanted to make sure that the ark was secure. He wanted to make sure that really it was a long way. It was rocky ground, hilly ground. We've got a better way of doing it, David believes. We'll put it in a wagon. It'll be nice and safe and secure. We'll have some beautiful, wonderful oxen to pull it all along and everything. But as it's going along, they hit some little rut or little rock in the road or something like that, and the ark teeters, and Uzzah reaches up and steadies the ark, and immediately falls down dead. And David's shocked. He is absolutely shocked that happened. He says, because you Levites did not carry the ark the first time, the anger of the Lord our God burst out against you. We failed to ask God how to move it properly. So even though David initially, at the very first, he pitches a little fit. He cannot believe that God would strike down someone who was trying to save the ark from falling. Someone who was trying to help in this case of what's going on. But then, upon reflection, upon seeing that God is always right, that God has these laws and rules for a reason, he says we should have asked. And we should have done it the way God wanted us to do it. And so, in my mind, as in David's, what's the difference between the staves and shoulders and the oxen and wagons? And I really like the way that Frank Chesser put this. He said, the difference is really obvious. It's obedience versus disobedience. God said, do it this way. You do it that way. It's the difference in walking by faith and walking by feeling. David felt like he had a better plan, a better idea. Submitting to God's will versus succumbing to self-will. And again, I think so oftentimes, our culture, especially nowadays, it's all about the self. It's what I want. It's what will make me happy. It's what will make me feel good. What will make you feel like you are a part of something. Or we watch a lot of documentaries and all that. And we was watching a documentary the other day, and it was about the interweb and all, and social media, and how all of these algorithms and things in social media work. And they keep learning, and they keep wanting to show you things that they think that you want to see, but the ulterior motive is it's what the advertisers want you to see. It's the influence that they want to have on you. And it's gotten to the point, my wife and I will be talking about something, outlandish. We'll just talking about going and getting, I went and got new glasses the other day. And we talked about doing that and all, and sure enough, we got got the Googles all over the house and all. Little speakers. It listens to you, folks. I'm telling you. All of a sudden, I'm getting ads on my Facebook about different websites that sell the glasses and everything. But it's that way of feeling a part of something. Feeling as though you're a part of that culture. That's not what God wanted. He wants us to be set apart. We're different than the culture around us. And it has to be with submitting to God's will versus that succumbing to the self-will. Respecting divine authority, yielding to human desire. Again, that's a really big one for us today. We're in a microwave society. And we'll talk about this more in just a moment. But we really, really, really want immediate gratification on everything. We ask a question, we want an answer right then. If we got a problem, we want it fixed right then. We don't want to wait for anything. We don't want to have any sort of patience. Esteeming the teaching of grace versus replacing it with precepts of men. That's a deep subject. We won't get that far. Pleasing God versus pleasing self. Again, that being selfish. Divine acceptance and blessing. In other words, we want God to accept us and have that blessing of that versus divine rejection and cursing. We sure don't want that. But look what happened to Saul. He did not seek to be accepted by God. He did not seek the blessings of God until he learned that he had sinned, learned that he had gotten in trouble. And that's just not the way to be. Done a lot of talking. Any comments, questions?
You talk about the contrast between Saul and God. There's a contrast also between Saul and David.
Mm-hmm.
But the difference between Saul and God is the holiness and sovereignty of God. But that's not David. David's got his own issues, his own problems, his own sins.
Yeah.
But it's the heart. The death of Uzzah.
Mm-hmm.
He was angry with God. Maybe you've been angry with God before, but most of us won't really express that.
Right.
That David's just totally transparent. You know what his heart is at any given moment. Not a pretentious bone in his body, I think. Just as flawed, just as much a sinner, but there's a heart difference between him and Saul. And this past year, I've been reading through, especially the Old Testament, I noticed that all the kings after David are held up to the standard of David. They did not follow God as David had done so. And it's strange, look at David and his sin, yet he is the standard. He was never idolatrous, but he is the one who had the heart that God was seeking.
Yeah. And it was that heart of contrition. When he did sin, he would fall on his face. And he knew it. And he would always come back to God. And it's, not only that, but throughout the Psalms, we have psalm after psalm where he tells God that he's angry, or tells God that his heart's breaking, or that all of these things, or that he's joyful, but he wears it on his sleeve the whole time. It's exactly right. And that's the way we should be too. That's what this whole thing is about, is that being contrite and coming back to God and having that redemption through Christ. And that's the qualities that David possessed. The second lesson, and this one's hard, is erected on the principle of that divine silence. And had to do with the building of the temple. And, it's one of those things that David, like I said, bless his heart, he wanted so bad to do so good or so much good. But, there are times when he kind of got ahead of himself. And so this happened when everything is going well. He decided that, hey, I want to build God a permanent dwelling place. I want God to be in a beautiful temple like all these other temples around. Instead of God being in a tent and a tabernacle and all, I want him to have his own house. And so he goes to ask Nathan about this idea. And Nathan, right off the bat, God's prophet, says, sure, the Lord is with you. He says that in 2 Samuel 7:3. But Nathan hadn't inquired of the Lord about this matter. They thought it was a given. They thought that, hey, this is a good thing. We need to do this. But it never really crossed their minds to ask God if that's what he wanted. So Nathan granted David permission for an action that God had not authorized. And God dealt with them by reminding them of the history of the nation. And it's a really cool set of scriptures. He asked a simple question of Nathan in 2 Samuel 7:7, which pointed out his silence on the matter of a dwelling place for God. He goes through the very back when with Moses. Did I ask Moses to build me a temple? Could Moses have done that? Well, yeah. How about Joshua? Could Joshua have done that? Well, yeah. Did I ask for that? No. So if these other men, he goes on and on about it, if these other men could have done it, if I'd asked them to do it, why do you think that you should do it now when I haven't asked you to do it either? And it's this whole idea, again, of realizing God is sovereign. And that's relative to religious matters and all matters. It is God's prerogative to speak. And it's our responsibility to listen. And so that's what we have to keep in mind. There are so many times when I pray, and again, that microwave is embedded. I've got a patience problem anyway, but I want an answer right then. And I'm not wanting to wait for an answer. I want the answer to come immediately. God is sovereign. He's in control. It is his prerogative to speak. And we have to be willing to, and patient enough, and responsible enough to listen and be attuned to listening. And I think that's I'm beginning to and it comes with maturity and gray hairs and all that maybe, but it's something we all need to work on all the time. I'm starting to hear God more when I read and study the Word. And I'm hearing more when we're worshiping and things. And I'm not saying there's James Earl Jones' voice in my head or anything like that, but it touches my heart more as I mature, as I'm able to focus more, as I'm able to practice my patience more, as I'm able to put away and turn my back on things of the world, which is really, really hard. But as you do that, you're able to attune to God even more. So God possesses the exclusive right to command, to affirm, and to decree. And even though Saul was the king of Israel, and David was the king And they had all these other kings. There's only one King of Kings. There's only one God. There's only one Jesus. And it's He who commands, affirms, and decrees. And it is our duty to listen, to submit, and to obey. It's a thing that Steve says, how you doing with that? I think that's something that we all need to exercise on a daily basis, every day. Is listening more, studying more, praying more, submitting more, and again, being attuned to God and following His Word, and following in the steps of Jesus, as we should. Any questions? Comments?
Yes, I had a question
Yeah.
about David. I enjoyed studying about him and hearing about it, but when it says that he was a man after God's own heart, is that in how he pursued God's heart, or is it how David had his own attributes in his, leading the kingdom, or both? If you've ever thought about it, when it says a man after God's own heart.
Absolutely, and I have. I've thought about it a lot, and I think that, what it is, it's all those things. I think that, as we said earlier, I think that David had such a tender heart and was so caring, and he felt things so deeply, both the celebrations and the sorrows. And I think it's those aspects of God that, are so helpful to us, because we know how of God's love for us and how much God cares for us and how God is always there, wanting to be there for us in all times. And I think David was that type of person. He was, he had, he was a man like we are, and he sinned, and boy, he had some whoppers. And I think Trey is next week, and I think he'll speak to that some more, I believe. Yeah, he'll talk about David's sins and his punishment for those sins.
The primary thing, like you're saying, was how he pursued God's heart.
Yeah.
I've heard that scripture so much, but
Yeah, I think so. I think it's because he pursued it, and also because he was penitent. When he realized that he had sinned, he was greatly, greatly penitent for that. Now, that goes back to our whole, this whole thing about us being able to come back to God, to get back to Him through that sin. And we have that now through grace, through Jesus. That's a good question. Think about some more. Other questions? Well, we're right on the money. Thank y'all so much for coming. Read some more